You don't move alone because you're strong. You move alone because you can't tolerate being ordinary anymore. If you always need backup, validation, noise around you, you're not powerful, you're dependent. And dependency is weakness dressed up as loyalty. Most men are terrified of being alone with their own thoughts. That's the real reason they travel in packs. They call it brotherhood. They call it networking. They call it staying connected. But strip it down. They need witnesses to feel important. Powerful men don't. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If your confidence drops when you walk into a room alone, you don't have confidence. You have borrowed status, and borrowed status always gets repossessed. Most men move in groups because it protects their ego. At work, they align with louder personalities, so they won't be targeted. With women, they show up with friends so rejection feels less personal. In social settings, they talk over each other to avoid silence. Silence exposes insecurity. Watch carefully. The man who can sit quietly at a table, say little, observe everything, and leave without explaining himself, that man controls the room. The loudest guy rarely does. This is where most men get it wrong. They think dominance is about visibility. It's about self-containment. When you move alone, you remove distraction. When you remove distraction, you sharpen perception. When perception sharpens, power becomes natural, and that makes people uncomfortable. If you need a crowd to feel respected, you're already disrespected. Respect that depends on numbers is fragile. At work, a powerful man doesn't gossip in groups about management. He doesn't join complaint circles. He doesn't look for alliances to feel safe. He delivers results, and he leaves. He understands something most men don't. The more you talk, the more people measure you. The more you reveal, the more they calculate your limits. Epictetus said, "First learn the meaning of what you say, and then speak." Most men speak first and think never. A powerful man speaks less because he understands leverage. Information is leverage. Emotional reactions are liabilities. Let's go deeper. Why do powerful men move alone? Because proximity dilutes identity. Spend enough time in weak circles, and your standards start negotiating. Your discipline starts bending. Your ambition gets softened by comfort. Seneca warned about this. He said we are more easily corrupted than corrected. That wasn't poetry, that was strategy. If you constantly surround yourself with men who tolerate mediocrity, you will normalize it. Powerful men are extremely protective of their environment. They understand that energy is contagious. So is weakness. You call it loyalty, he calls it dead weight. That's harsh, but it's real. Look at your circle. How many of them challenge you? How many secretly compete with you? How many would celebrate your success privately, but resent it publicly? Most men don't outgrow their environment because they fear being labeled arrogant. Powerful men accept the label. Because they know this, growth requires separation. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet wrote in his journal about self-discipline, restraint and detachment. He wasn't seeking approval from the crowd. He was mastering himself in isolation. Power begins internally, and internal work requires solitude. A powerful man doesn't chase validation from female attention. He doesn't need a group of friends to approach someone. He doesn't need to post his social proof online. He doesn't need to prove desirability, because his value is internal. Here's what most men don't understand. Women can sense when a man is calibrated by external approval. If your mood shifts depending on how she responds, you're not leading, you're reacting. Powerful men move alone because they are emotionally self-regulated. They don't outsource their self-worth. That's rare, and rarity is power. If you can't walk away alone, you'll stay where you're not respected. This is where most men lose control. At work, they tolerate subtle disrespect because they fear isolation. In relationships, they tolerate emotional manipulation because they fear starting over. In friendships, they tolerate mockery disguised as humor because they fear exclusion. But a man who is comfortable alone cannot be trapped. He can leave the table, and that ability changes the power dynamic instantly. The strongest negotiation position is the willingness to walk away. Moving alone trains that muscle. Let's talk status. Most men perform status. Powerful men embody it. There's a difference. Performance requires an audience. Embodiment does not. When you move alone, people project onto you. They try to decode you. Mystery increases perceived value. But if you're always available, always explaining, always engaging, you remove intrigue. Epictetus taught control over perception, not the world, not other people. Perception. If you control yourself, you influence perception naturally. If you try to control perception directly, you look desperate. That's why powerful men move alone. They don't manage impressions, they manage themselves. You're afraid that if you step back, they'll forget you. That fear exposes neediness. Powerful men are not afraid of being forgotten because they understand something deeper. Absence increases weight. When you're not constantly present, your presence gains value. At work, the man who speaks only in meetings when necessary carries more authority than the one who fills silence. In social circles, the man who doesn't overshare becomes the reference point. Scarcity creates demand, but only if your substance is strong. Moving alone forces you to build that substance. Let's get uncomfortable. Some of you don't move alone because you don't trust yourself. Silence makes you anxious, stillness makes you restless, solitude makes you confront weaknesses you've been hiding. Discipline feels heavier without distraction, but that's exactly why you need it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, control your mind or it will control you. When you move alone, there is no social anesthesia, no jokes to mask insecurity, no noise to drown out doubt, no applause to inflate ego, just you, and that's where power is forged. Your circle might like you, but they don't fear losing you. If your absence wouldn't shift dynamics, you're replaceable. Powerful men create psychological weight by being self-contained. They don't chase invites, they don't overcommit, they don't beg for inclusion, and because of that, their presence becomes selective. Selective presence builds perceived status, not arrogance. Calibration. Seneca practiced voluntary discomfort. He would strip away luxury to remind himself he didn't depend on it. That's power. If you can remove comfort voluntarily, no one can use it against you. Moving alone is voluntary discomfort, and it builds unshakable independence. Now imagine this. You walk into work alone. You don't rush to greet everyone. You don't check who's aligned with who. You focus, you deliver, you leave. People start adjusting their behavior around you. Why? Because you are not predictable, and unpredictability commands attention, not chaos. Control. There's a difference. Most men want power. Very few want responsibility. When you move alone, there's no one to blame. If you fail, it's yours. If you succeed, it's yours. That level of ownership is terrifying for average men. They prefer shared mediocrity over isolated excellence. But powerful men accept the isolation because they understand the trade-off. Loneliness for leverage, silence for clarity, detachment for control. This doesn't mean you avoid alliances. It means you don't depend on them. You choose partnerships from strength, not need. You collaborate without losing autonomy. You engage without attachment. That's the difference. Epictetus said you become what you give attention to. If your attention is constantly scattered among opinions, group politics and validation loops, you weaken your edge. When you move alone, your attention sharpens, and attention is your greatest weapon. You think moving alone means being antisocial. No, it means being internally sovereign. You can be in a crowd without being absorbed. You can have relationships without being controlled. You can lead without announcing it. Powerful men don't isolate because they hate people. They isolate strategically to refine themselves. Then they re-enter the world sharper, like a blade. Here's the final truth. Moving alone isn't about ego. It's about discipline. It's about proving to yourself that your identity is not dependent on applause, companionship, or reassurance. It's about knowing that if everyone walked away tomorrow, you would still stand. Most men fear being alone because they haven't built themselves enough to enjoy their own company. Powerful men have, and that's why they move differently. They don't need constant conversation. They don't need to prove their worth. They don't react to every slight. They don't explain every decision. They move quietly, decisively, alone when necessary. Because they understand something most men learn too late. If you can stand alone, you can stand anywhere. If you need a crowd, you're already compromised. So ask yourself honestly, are you surrounded because you're powerful? Or are you surrounded because you're afraid? Fix that. Build internal authority. Detach from noise. Strengthen your mind. And when you walk into a room alone, make sure your presence feels heavier than 10 men combined. That's power. If this exposed you, good. That means you're paying attention. Subscribe if you're ready to stop performing strength and start embodying it.